where do you see the US-EU conflict going? Because, I always think about when the British left the EU, there was this saying the British always had, which was, it's better that we're good neighbors rather than in a bad marriage, and to let them get some distance, because US and EU has also overlapping interests. The cooperation would be good, but I think we have to redefine the relationship again, find a new form, because if we keep the same form, I think that this is what will cause a lot of the conflicts. But again, there's very little reason I have for optimism these days about the willingness to flesh out these ideas and redefine the relationship between the US and EU. But yeah, again, making my question a lot shorter. Where where do you see the US and EU conflict going?
That's a really good question. I think if I were in America, the way I'd be thinking about this, if I were wanting to get this right, would be, I doubt that we'll have CIA operatives acting against the EU, although it's not impossible. It's not impossible if they feel that the EU is acting against their national security interests. What I think is probably more likely and much more practical is that the Americans will offer support to people who they believe are prepared to act in America's vital national interests, and make sure there's no support whatsoever to anybody who's not. But I would also hope that there's another piece of thinking in the EU where people start to think, do we want to act against America's vital national interests? And furthermore, is it in our national interest to act against America's vital interests? And the answer is surely not. The answer is surely not, because we have long and strong relationships with the United States, and they go back through decades, through most of the last century, and we sort of share many values. So I think, to me, there's a values-based piece of it. There's also an economic-based part of it. At the moment, it is not in our national interest to actually force ourselves through sanctions to actually bear some of the highest energy prices in the world. We are net and significant net hydrocarbons importers. I think we're the world's largest region, and we're imposing on ourselves some of the highest prices for those hydrocarbons. I work in the offshore energy sector, and I can tell you that one of the key factors in driving prices up has been a regime of sanctions which have replaced Russian LNG with American LNG at twice the price. And it means as well that we only have two obvious sources of LNG in the world. The first is United States, and the second is Qatar. And if the United States decide that they're struggling a bit for energy reasons and energy dominance, don't think for one moment they'll keep exporting LNG to Europe and cut off their own noses. They won't. So we need to be super careful and think really, really carefully about our energy supplies, because not only because of the centrality of energy, but also the centrality of energy to industry. So in terms of economics, things aren't looking terrific in the EU at the moment. I think I can't speak for the rest of the EU countries, but we're into our second month of negative growth, 0.1% for 2 months. I suspect that's going to roll out across Europe. I suspect Germany, I think, is already in recession. So there are good reasons, I think, to start to think about that relationship in a very different way. And I think the fundamental question for Europeans to ask is not how the EU operates with America, but whether the EU is the right vehicle for operations for relationship with America. The Americans clearly think it isn't. And to think whether we need some other form or some form of EU minus, which might be more easier for the Americans to understand and to work with, and perhaps might also work better with some of the way that the EU political parties are moving. If you look at Reform in this country, AFD in America, and National NR in France, all of whom are looking askance at the EU. I think there's an open question about what the EU should look like. My experience is much more in the NATO side, and I've got a much clearer view on that. But if the EU doesn't evolve, then I think it's doomed. There was I think Charles Darwin said that that species that survive best are not the ones that are cleverest, nor the ones that are the most powerful, but those ones that can adapt. And if the EU can't adapt to this new changing context, then I think its time is limited.
Yeah. Now, adjusting to the vital interest of other great powers, I think, is quite important. This is this is something that I often cited Kissinger saying back in 2014. But he said it with the Russians. If we recognize that the Russians are a great power, then the first thing we do is define their vital interests, to what extent we're able to live with those, and if that's possible, the rest can be arranged. Things can be done. But now I think we have to do the same with the U.S. But it's always strange with the Europeans, though. We're either all for the U.S. and full subordination, or we're fiercely against them and this anti-American sentiments. I think this is why maybe a bit of distance is okay, because there should be a middle ground here somewhere. But I spoke to, as Americans are quite connected or plugged into the U.S. government there, and they tell me that what will be the relationship with Europe after the as the US embraces this multipolar world where it has to prioritize other regions. What is the interest in Europe? And you kind of see two different models. One will be, one is we have to extract some industries like they're doing now with Germany, find a way of almost to pay tribute. The other model is no, the Europeans have to they should keep their own industries and strength. However, they should be the exclusive economic bloc of the US. But in this instance, the EU would have to disconnect from China, Russia, and other rivals of the United States. But this would make the EU much less prosperous and much more dependent on the US. So it's not as if it's going to be, it looks like both sides have a deep-seated interest in finding a different relationship, given that the world has changed so much. And no, it's. I wish that's a conversation that would emerge in the EU Parliament. Besides beating their chest, calling for war, and telling us about all their wonderful values. I think this would be something they should be discussing.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that I've often thought that actually the vassalage to America has been against Europeans' national interests, and we've done things which we probably wouldn't have done. And I think the best friends are those who are able to tell you something that you might not like. At least you know that. I mean, it would have been much better, for example, I think, if Britain had not gone into the Iraq War. I think it was a major mistake, and they often say that the two people who could have stopped that war are Tony Blair and Colin Powell. And I think had Tony Blair not simply gone with what George Bush wanted, I think we would have had that might not have worked out in the way it did. But the point I'm making is not about that war, but about having a relationship where actually you can say, well, yeah, we understand you want to do this, but actually it's not in our national interest. A very good example was Vietnam. Now, I think the Australians came into Vietnam on the American side, but I don't think any Europeans did, although we were pushed to by the Americans, but we didn't think it was in our national interest. And I think it's about time that Europeans started actually trying to regain a bit of self-confidence, because you can't be self-confident if you just do whatever America wants, and being prepared to operate in our own national interests and define those national interests. And whereas in the past we've said it's in our vital national interest to keep America in NATO, well, hopefully not, because America's going out of NATO, that's obvious. And I've never thought that it was in our vital national interest. So I think it's about time we looked at our own vital national interests. They won't be the same across all the nations, but looked at those national interests, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of economics, as you've suggested, and then work out what sort of relationships within Europe might best facilitate those national interests, and what sort of relationships with the Americans might also facilitate those national interests. Because neither of the models that you described from America partners, the American side of the Atlantic, neither of those do I find particularly attractive. And I think we should be prepared to actually look after ourselves and think about our relationships with Russia and China. We seem to be rabidly anti-Russia here at the moment in Europe, and a little bit less rabidly, but still anti-China. Let's work out how we have better relationships with those two great powers. People talk a lot about, well, it's difficult to have a relationship with China and Russia because they're authoritarian. Why in that case do we have strong relationships with Gulf partners who are equally, if not more, authoritarian? It's hypocritical. I'm not saying that there would be easy relationships, but much better to have relationships where we talk to people and we at least understand their situations, and much more pragmatic and less interventional and less inclined, as Europeans do, to impose our values on other people. So I think it's time for, I don't know what John Mearsheimer would call it, but perhaps I would sort of call it pragmatic realism in those relationships. And perhaps that's the best place for the Europeans to think, and cooperation on in our common European heartland.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think this is why when there's all this pressure to always to be so closely allied, one has to force the same policies, for same economic policy, same foreign policy. This is what prevents us from having actual pursuing basic national interests, because we don't have the same interest. And I think this is, in a multipolar world, the interest will even be more divergent. So the attempting to force everything into everyone walking in lockstep the whole time, like you said, has made Europeans make some very foolish decisions, which hasn't been in our interest, which is now, well, coming back to bite us, I guess. Anyways, as always, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, just been a pleasure again, Glenn. And let's I'd say to your listeners, I think this, I always find this a terrific podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed a number of your recent podcasts, but particularly with Ray McGovern. He's always very interesting and very insightful. And I think for your listeners, certainly in my country, then if they're interested in what we're saying, please spread the word. There is an appetite out there, and I read the comments, and what's clear is that people are fed up with the lack of intelligent analysis or even debate within the mainstream media, and we need to break out of that. We will, because defeat will force the mainstream media to break out of it. But the sooner we can get out of that closed thinking and that ideological thinking you described, and the sooner we can get into intelligent debate and start to debate in our populations about the issues which you and I have discussed today, the better.
And I always make the point, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm mistaken. Surely I'm not correct all the time. But again, the main, then one doesn't have to be, but there should be a discussion there at least. The fact that there's no discussion about these tremendous changes, I think this is a concern, a big concern. So thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you, Glenn. Thank you for all you do.